August 27. Most of the fiction featuring Hattie and Jordan end with one of the Chamber of Blood, Day of Night, Mahan Singh, 1. Mahan Singh spent 17 years amassing a fortune for his estranged niece by leading mercenary missions all over the world for Leviathan Securities. A decorated soldier in the Indian Army, Mahan was discharged after 13 years of service for disobeying orders while on assignment for the United Nations. Shortly afterward, he joined Leviathan and found himself on a series of strange assignments that involved securing haunted locations and procuring strange artifacts of an occult nature. Locations and artifacts that seemed worthless, but were of grave importance to governments and organizations for some reason or another. Mahan didn't know what to make of it. To him, it all felt like a kind of invisible war between secret societies that were somehow able to use governments and corporations like pieces on a chessboard for a bunch of old, moldy books and geometric trinkets from forgotten civilizations. Now Mahan was pinned behind a crumbling wall in a village in the outskirts of Nairobi, Kenya, with his fallen units scattered in pieces all over the surrounding dirt roads. He had been fighting all day against different units and was fresh out of luck and ammunition. "There's no way out of here," he told himself. "I've got no support, no ammunition, no luck." Why do you need luck when you have a weapon and your wits? You've been in worse situations and survived. Think you are beaten, and you are beaten. I am beaten. You are almost beaten, and that's not the same thing. Suddenly, Mahan heard the surrounding mercenaries yelling at one another in Russian. They were planning an attack and coordinating with one another. He peeked around the corner, then ducked fast as several rounds punched holes into the wall, sending clouds of dust and stone into the air. He cursed in Punjabi, grabbed his automatic rifle, then craned his head ever so slightly to see fast-moving silhouettes against the full moon, closing in on his position. Quickly, he crawled into a nearby home and hid the asset, the ancient scroll, underneath several corpses of British agents he had killed just before the Russians had decided to join their party. Then he hid in the shadows, holding his rifle by the barrel, refusing to die without a fight. They probably all work for the Collector, he told himself. Crazy rich man with too much time and money on his hands. Shaw just wants to make sure he gets the scroll before another eccentric billionaire beats him to it. And from where does this prize come? It supposedly comes from a lost elder civilization with advanced and forbidden knowledge. Nonsense, all of it. A bunch of ancient stories about pagan priests and barbaric rituals and cosmic deities told around a campfire. Ancient sci-fi at best. Taking a deep breath, Mahan heard their almost inaudible footfalls before he saw them. His eyes narrowed and his face hardened as two mercs entered the moonlit doorway. With a groan, he launched himself into the air, smashing the butt of his rifle against one head and then the other. Both mercs collapsed to the ground, unconscious. A split second later, Mahan yanked a loaded rifle from the hands of one of the fallen mercs and rushed through the doorway, taking cover behind a well spilling over with thick, buzzing flies like living black soup. Inside the well were the rotting bodies of those who had sought the scroll but had found death instead. Mahan buried his nose in his arm and suppressed an instinct to retch. Then, seeing a merc, he lifted his rifle and pulled the trigger. Bullets tore holes through the neck and face as the mercenary staggered back and forth, then fell against a wagon with the pulpy head hanging by a shred of flesh. As he searched the shadows for other mercs, Mahan suddenly heard the crunch of stone behind him. He whirled to fire, a second too late. Several rounds pounded into his Kevlar vest like a jackhammer, sending him stumbling backward into the black soup of death. A moment later, the surviving mercs loomed over the mouth of the well as a thick black fog coiled around them like a snake. Taking a deep breath, Mahan closed his eyes and waited for a death that never came. Instead of a report ripping through the darkness like a clap of thunder, he heard a scream, followed by a cry and then shrieks of agony. When he opened his eyes, the mercs were gone, as though they had been erased by the fog. Mahan struggled through the putrid blood and fluids to climb up and out of the well. As he pulled himself over the gore-covered mouth, he noticed the world had been plunged into an abyss of fog. Before he could make any sense of what was happening, something snatched his ankle hard and tried to pull him back down. Desperately, Mahan gripped the edge of the well and held on tightly. He looked to his feet where he saw multiple hands yanking and clutching at his legs. He held on for dear life, but his hands slipped in the blood and gore and soon gave way. With a terrible cry, he fell back into the gore as bony hands clawed at his legs, his arms, his throat, his beard, his nose, his turban, and pulled him deeper and deeper into the darkness. Needles of pain burst inside his head as he drowned in thick fermenting blood. He knew with a strange resignation that he was dying, or that he was already dead, and that he would never know his niece or what had become of her. After his wife and parents had died in a plane crash and his brother had disappeared, she was the only one left. She was his only family, and he swore he would always take care of her. But then life happened, and in the end he had only taken care of himself. He had lived a lonely, selfish life, counter to his upbringing and his beliefs. He was a walking contradiction who had somehow convinced himself that he was cursed, that everyone he had ever loved died or disappeared, and that he was doing his niece a favor by staying out of her life. He had somehow convinced himself that he was keeping his bad luck away from her, while he amassed a fortune that he would one day leave her. But Mahan knew it was all a lie. He didn't know the first thing about nurturing and raising a human being. Raising his brother's daughter terrified him, and that's why he had clung to any reason he could to abandon her. All he knew was killing and destroying in the name of governments and corporations. And as the darkness swallowed him whole, Mahan realized in horror that killing and destroying was all he would ever know. Mahan had failed his ancestors, he had failed his family, he had failed his brother and his niece. He would never know her hopes, her dreams, her likes or dislikes. He would know nothing except the inky blackness that swept over his eyes and the unnameable terrors that awaited him in the great unknown. Mahan opened his eyes with a start. He was still in the well, submerged in the putrid death stew, staring up at thick black fog drifting over him, as he heard a whirring sound, the sound of a motor accelerating and decelerating somewhere in the distance. He took a moment to gather his senses. He didn't remember much. He remembered being shot, stumbling back and falling into the well. Everything after that moment felt like a nightmare that had been inspired by one of his father's stories. The one where unarmed, peaceful protesters were shot dead and stuffed into a well, and left to rot in the blistering Punjab heat. With a painful groan, Mahan reached out with trembling hands to a jutting rock, and with difficulty, pulled himself free from the gore. Rock by rock, he climbed his way up the festering throat of the well and finally pulled himself over the mouth and into the thick black fog. A cry sounded over the incessant whir of the machine, and Mahan quickly realized he wasn't in Kenya anymore. He stood and took in his surroundings. There were strange structures like factories submerged in the fog. Scattered around the structures were piles of clothes and bodies set ablaze. Above in the pale red sky, crows circled and cawed, adding to the oppressive cacophony. "Help, please." Mahan heard a woman crying for help coming from a bank of fog. Snapping out of his daze, he extended his hands and waved a tunnel through the fog, searching for the source of the sound. "Help, someone, please." The disembodied voice reached him again, and she somehow seemed close and far at the same time. He froze to listen carefully, but all he could hear was the incessant whirring of the motor accelerating and decelerating. "Help." There it was again. He moved left, then right, and finally he reached a woman in pilot fatigues, stuck in a trap of twisted barbed wire. Without a word, he pulled the metal thorns out of her legs as she winced and squirmed in pain with every movement.
I don't know what happened or how I ended up here.
Her voice trailed away, and she seemed bewildered. What's the last thing you remember? Mahan asked as he struggled with the barbed wire. The pilot stumbled back and answered with intermittent groans as she nursed her wounds.
I was on patrol, soaring through clear blue skies, when this black cloud suddenly appeared, and then the plane began to shake and break apart, and I don't know. I was here.
A sudden click, and they both turned wide-eyed to face the barrel of a rifle. Behind the rifle, a man in black fatigues appraised them.
Who the fuck are you two?
Mahan raised a hand. Wait! Careful. We're not a threat. We're just as confused as you.
Who are you and what are you doing in Texas? Are you CIA? Is this some kind of test?
Mahan gritted his teeth. This ain't a test, and I'm pretty sure this ain't Texas.
Who are you?
The agent shoved his rifle in Mahan's face. But before Mahan could answer, a Japanese woman in a black and red kimono emerged from the fog, unsheathing a katana with a high-pitched ring. She yelled at them in Japanese, and Mahan extended a calming hand to her. "Please, put the sword down." He then turned to the agent. "Please, put the gun down. Let's figure this out."
"Who are you?"
the agent yelled, pushing the muzzle in Mahan's face.
"I won't ask again."
"I can tell you who I am, but that's not the question, is it?"
"Yeah. What's the question, then?"
"Where?" Mahan said flatly, motioning to the destroyed factories, the craters, and the smoldering piles of trash and bodies. "I should think the question is, where? Where are we?" Another voice came from behind.
"He's right, you know."
Mahan turned to watch a man with a police jacket emerge from the fog.
"We're still trying to figure that one out. Right now, we should all be asking, how?"
"How?" Mahan repeated.
"Yes," the detective said. "How much time do we have before the horror finds—"
Before he could finish his sentence, a shriek, followed by a high-pitched whine, startled them. A moment later, a mass of melded humanity and machine came at them. Mahan could make out several heads, all shrieking battle cries in different languages, attached to a patchwork of charred scraps from missiles, tanks, fighter jets, and nuclear submarines, all bearing flags and strange logos of brands from different periods he vaguely remembered. He stared at this monstrous chimera in shock and wasn't quite sure what he was looking at. "The horror," he called it, "looks more like the embodiment of war. Sponsored war." Mahan swallowed a thickness growing in his throat as the horror rushed the stunned agent and tore his head off, swallowing the terrified face and dripping neck like a ripe cherry. Then its ghastly mouth opened wide, and a stream of fire torched the jerking headless corpse as it collapsed into a heap of industrial garbage. Not waiting to be next, the samurai lunged at the monstrosity, and with incredible speed and precision, cut it to pieces. Then all of them watched in disbelief as the pieces of flesh and metal slowly disintegrated into the living fog. The detective sighed.
"It will be back,"
he said, appraising the samurai.
18th or 19th century, Red Crown clan. You're not the first. We could definitely use your skills here."
The samurai sheathed her katana and grasped at the fog as though trying to capture pieces of it to study, as though she recognized it. Mahan approached the detective. "Where exactly is here?" But the detective didn't answer. He merely turned his back on them and walked away, saying,
"Follow me, if you want to escape."
Mahan took in a deep breath and gathered his senses. Then he took to his heels and followed the detective into the unknown with the samurai and the fighter pilot in tow. Mahan followed the detective through a labyrinth of bombed-out factories and mountains of garbage set ablaze. At the center of this industrial hell was a giant machine with hooks and cameras and television screens of every possible brand and size, broadcasting moments of Mahan's life, as though his brain was a Wi-Fi signal that could stream his memories, his darkest memories. And not just his memories, but the memories of the samurai, the pilot, and the detective. It was as though they had been selected by some unnameable and incompressible intelligence for mere entertainment. The detective stopped when he reached what seemed to be a submarine hatch, surrounded by a pile of smoldering trash and mangled, charred bodies.
"Get in,"
he yelled, opening the hatch.
"I'll explain what I know when we're safe."
"Where does it lead?" Mahan asked.
"Away from here," the detective said, "and that's all you should care about right now. We don't have time for explanations, but when we're safe, Ben will answer all your questions as best he can. Right now, you need to—"
A clanking noise suddenly interrupted him.
"Go, go, go!"
the detective yelled as the horror came at them from the shadows. Instantly, he pulled out his flashlight, distracting the horror as Mahan and the others escaped down the hatch.
That's right. That's me, baby.